should have insisted on the labelling of goods so that we could have a boycott of settlement goods. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
At this point, where we are in the minority of the UN, it doesn't look like any form of global leadership at all. It looks like rank cowardice that we are not doing it. Probably the last remaining ability to provide any comparable support to the process at this point is for the UK to recognise Palestine.
I think we should have moved on sanctions much earlier.
Right.
We didn't move on sanctions because of immense pressure. All sanctions were an expression of anti-Semitism, and that was what was the case being put by the State of Israel. We now know this to be wrong. Presumably, if you support a two-state solution, you do support a Palestinian state, so you will at some stage say that you recognise a Palestinian state. What will it take to get you there? And I think what is changing at the moment is what we are hearing from some Israeli ministers about annexation, reoccupation of Gaza, which would seem to remove almost entirely the prospect of a territorial state of Palestine. And it may be that the time has come for the United Kingdom and others, in order to prevent it being completely removed from a possibility, to say, well, we're prepared to recognise to keep this alive. It won't make it happen, and other things need to happen, but the argument may be changing.
You think if there's a strong prospect of annexation taking place next year, that recognition should take place before then?
We can only go off what we're hearing, and as people are now keen to say, when people tell you what they're going to do, you ought to listen to them. And Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have made no secrets of their belief that annexation should take place, because their belief is not in a 1967 borders Israel, but in a different one. They have some popular support for that, particularly because the security situation has changed and everything else. Now, there are claims that...
It's worse than that, isn't it?
Sorry?
I thought it was worse than that. I thought that the current Netanyahu government have actually backtracked from the idea of being in favour of a two-state solution as well. So although they may not be using such florid language as the two that you've mentioned, the government itself now seems to not be in favour of two states.
It's certainly true that the public policy of Israel now is to assert its sovereignty. I'm afraid I have to use the phrase, from the river to the sea. That is the position of the Israeli government on its sovereignty. And that implies, as you say, that even though we now know that Prime Minister Netanyahu's commitment to a two-state solution, if it was ever there, is certainly not there now, that then does beg a whole series of other questions.
And do you recognise that there are two things that are happening here, one of which is that we are close approaching the point at which recognising anything is to recognise a state that can't exist because Israel has fully annexed it, at which point it has no value whatsoever. And the fact that at this point, where we are in the minority of the UN, it doesn't look like any form of global leadership at all. It looks like rank cowardice that we are not doing it when everyone else has. And especially when you started off by saying there are very few levers that the UK has to pull. We are a P5. Actually, the probably the last remaining ability to provide any comparable support to the process at this point is for the UK to recognise Palestine.
I suppose I'm hesitant because it would be strange if I came here and sort of reversed something that I'd said for years. There will be one or two things I wish we'd changed. But the recognition, as I say, it's symbolic, but it doesn't do anything else. But in company with others at a crucial time, maybe because the timing of comments to Israel is very important. Israel is influenced. It wants to know that if it's hearing criticism, it's from those who are acting in good company. So it can't simply say, oh, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Israel has a very long list of countries it just doesn't listen to because it believes they're all against them for anti-Semitic reasons and others. But if the United Kingdom, a friend, was to say something in company with other friends, it's going to listen very carefully. So that is leverage.
Before we go back to Absalom, just because you did say it, so I'm going to ask, you don't have to say. You said you had one or two things that you wish that you had done. Do you want to tell us what they are before we move, were they in relation to the Middle East?
Oh, yeah. I'm even-handed because I think you need to be in these complex circumstances. Let me say two things. Firstly, The polarization now of the debate is as acute as anything I've ever seen. And it's changed the way in which we deal with the debate in the UK and all over the world.
Yeah.
It's hardly possible to be in my position of expressing empathy for the victims of October the 7th without someone saying, oh, so you support a genocide nation, do you?
Yeah.
And expressing empathy for those who've been killed in Gaza. Oh, do you want Hamas to win? We all know it. I mean, you'll be reading it in the stuff that comes to you, and we read it on the internet and everything else. I've never known it so polarised. Most of my working life in politics has been dealing with people who have seen it from both sides. There are injustices here for Palestinian people dating back to 1948, but this won't be solved by pretending Israel can be erased or anything. Equally, we do want to live in peace with our neighbours, but we've got to be secure. How can we achieve this? This is now much more difficult. So being even-handed and recognising faults on all sides, I think, is still important. The two things I would look at in specifics to policy on Israel and Palestine would be, I think we should have taken action against settlements much earlier. I think the fact that settlements have been allowed to grow with no consequence has done a lot of damage. I think it's fueled a sense of impunity among certain politicians in Israel who, because if you have significant condemnation but no action, well, what's anyone going to do when you take the next step?
And what should that action have been? We've now got sanctions. Is that sufficient?
I think we should have moved on sanctions much earlier.
Right.
We didn't move on sanctions because of immense pressure on any sanctions policy as being motivated by the wrong determination. All sanctions were an expression of anti-Semitism, and that was what was the case being put by the State of Israel. We now know this to be wrong. You can't have the criticism we've seen of Israel over the past year, particularly from those in Tel Aviv protesting about the Prime Minister, to be told that all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Plainly it's not, and I think we've now moved past that. I think we should have been clearer that international law matters. The settlement process was advancing quite genuinely under our noses, and there should have been action. And you can start with sanctions on individuals, but you can spread it to a wider trade sanction and all that. This would be a massive change in policy, but what do you do? Because what's now happened, and Mr. Morello said it, you needn't talk about annexation. It's already happened. There are plenty who say that sort of formal annexation is unnecessary. It's already there. And what are we going to do with that situation? So I think we could have challenged that earlier, and that might have helped in dealing with a sense of impunity in certain politicians, which has now reached the stage on annexation.
I'm going back to Absalom, I promise, but I've got one more because I just want to make sure that we're absolutely clear about what you're saying. You're saying that we should have been tougher in relation to settlements, and we should have had. We should have made sure that we had sanctions against individuals, but I think you also talked about trade sanctions as well.
I think, again, we avoided that. If you
You're saying we should have
yes.
we should have insisted on the labelling of goods so that we could have a boycott of settlement goods.
We didn't do that. If you go
Is that
back,
what you're saying?
Yes. What would have been better? What we have now, or a policy which would have called out the settlements at an earlier stage, even if there'd been there would have been a huge campaign. But what would have been better? To do that and say the reason why we think settlements are wrong and illegal is so-and-so, and we are keeping alive the possibility of two states. I think that would have been better and worth the... And dealing with the exceptionalism of Israel 10 years or so ago might have helped.